You want to talk about jealousy? Forget the Sunday school version where Satan throws a tantrum over losing his shine. The real fracture came the second he realized the promotion wasn't going to him, it was going to a human. That's right. A creature made of carbon and bacteria, built from dirt, gets crowned as the image and likeness of God. And not just image, heir. That's where the rage ignited. This wasn't jealousy of beauty. It was outrage over inheritance. He saw the divine plan not as poetry, but as a power transfer. The throne wasn't just for God anymore. It was expanding, and that expansion bypassed him. Picture this, the celestial assembly is briefed on the Son of Man. A being born of dust but destined to sit on the throne beside the Almighty, ruling not just heaven but earth, all realms under one authority. Every archangel processes that as divine progress. But not him. He hears something else, replacement protocol. The favorite son, the luminous one, is no longer the prototype of leadership. The blueprint's been rewritten. Dominion is going biological. That's the betrayal. He's not jealous of humanity's shape, he's disgusted by its purpose. The idea that fragile, time-bound beings could be promoted into the divine council. That was an insult. Because from his perspective, divinity wasn't something you receive, it's something you earn. He'd existed for eons perfecting obedience, mastering resonance, walking the fire corridor of the throne. And suddenly, God announces, "I will share my glory with flesh." To him, that was corruption disguised as compassion. He saw mercy as nepotism. This is where his rebellion takes on genius-level logic. He didn't say, "I'll destroy mankind." He said, "I'll prove they're unworthy." You catch that? He doesn't need to attack God directly. He just needs to discredit the heir. If the heir fails, the will collapses. The inheritance stays frozen. That's why he becomes the accuser. It's not random, it's legal strategy. His entire identity becomes one word, objection. That's why the serpent doesn't tempt Eve with murder or hate. He tempts her with qualification. You can be like God. He's triggering the same virus that infected him, the obsession with equality without process. He's saying, prove you deserve your title. And when she takes the bait, he wins the first round of his lawsuit. Humanity disqualifies itself on record. Heaven's new heir collapses before even sitting on the throne. Case closed, right? Not quite. Because this isn't about sin, it's about lineage. The rebellion morphs into generational warfare. Every human born after carries that fracture in their code. He doesn't need to kill them, he just needs to keep them disinherited. You understand? The fall of man wasn't just moral, it was administrative. The bloodline meant to ascend got legally entangled in rebellion. That's why he calls himself the prince of this world. It's not arrogance, it's accurate. The estate defaulted to him through forfeiture. You think this is mythology? Look at the internal logic. Every system of authority follows the same pattern: inheritance challenged, legitimacy questioned, lineage sabotaged. The war in heaven was never about territory, it was about succession rights. And the Son of Man, this divine human hybrid, was the symbol of that succession. The one destined to reconcile heaven and matter, spirit and dust, eternal and temporal. He's not angry because God rules, he's furious because God decided to share. And here's the twist that most people miss: when the Son of Man prophecy emerged, it wasn't just about one figure. It was a category. Humanity was the seedbed for divine authority. That's why the rebellion became an obsession. If he could corrupt the bloodline, if he could pervert the carriers of the image, he could permanently invalidate the plan. So he goes systemic. He doesn't show up with fire and brimstone, he shows up with ideology, breeding programs, spiritual sabotage, intermingling. Every myth that talks about divine beings mating with humans? That's the strategy: pollute the heir's genome. Mix the divine image with distortion until there's no pure lineage left to inherit. The book calls him the dragon that stood before the woman ready to devour her child. That's not a fairy tale, it's legal symbolism. The woman represents the line of inheritance, the human vessel. The dragon stands guard at birth because the heir threatens his reign. He's not afraid of humanity's morality, he's afraid of their potential. If one human ever stands clean in alignment with the original blueprint, the throne transfers back. That's the entire cosmic drama, prevent that alignment at any cost. That's why his rebellion never ends. He doesn't stop after the fall. He builds an entire empire of interception. Temples, systems, altars, tools to keep the worship loop broken. Because the more fractured humanity stays, the more power remains locked in escrow. His kingdom isn't built on brute force, it's built on bureaucratic delay. Keep the heir guilty, and the paperwork of restoration never clears. And here's the most disturbing part. The other celestial beings know this. They witnessed the proclamation that humans would one day judge angels. You think that line was metaphorical? It wasn't. That's the verdict that broke him. Imagine spending eternity as the prototype of perfection, then being told one day, those creatures you guard will outrank you. That's not just emotion. That's humiliation at a cosmic scale. So, he flips the narrative. He rebrands rebellion as enlightenment. He takes the insult and spins it into philosophy, you are not fallen, you are free. The same slogan he whispered in his own mind before the war. And suddenly, his movement has meaning. He's not the villain, he's the liberator. The so-called enemy becomes the advocate for self-divinization. Every culture that ever worshipped gods who rebelled against heaven? That's him, wearing a new name, running the same campaign. Why wait for inheritance when you can seize it yourself? The throne room isn't peace, it's combustion. Light folding over light. A council of fire where sound itself kneels. And in the center, him, the guardian of radiance, a being so charged with divine voltage that creation bends around his presence. He stands while others bow. He doesn't breathe humility, he is authority. Every movement burns like command. He was born inside the throne's architecture. He knows the circuits of glory like a soldier knows a weapon. Then the decree drops like a thunderclap, bow to the new creation. Bow to the image made of dust. You can almost feel heaven freeze. Because this isn't a request. It's a restructuring. Every order, every hierarchy, every cosmic rank is suddenly told to orbit around something made out of soil. Not light. Not fire. Not eternity, dust. And that's when it happens. The silence breaks. One voice says, no. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Refusal. Not because he hates creation, but because he refuses to kneel before something inferior to his design. That's where rebellion is born, not from darkness, but from pride disguised as purity. He isn't some cartoon villain with horns. He's the perfect servant who decided he would rather fracture heaven than downgrade himself. In his logic, he's protecting divine order from dilution. You see the twist now? Satan didn't rebel against God because he wanted chaos. He rebelled because he wanted purity without submission. In that instant, eternity gains a counterweight. Heaven meets its first contradiction. And every loyal watcher, every seraph, every cherub, can feel the air split. He was called the covering cherub. That title means proximity. The closest to the throne. The one who could walk among the stones of fire. The firewall of divinity. And suddenly, the firewall turns against the system it was built to protect. Picture this moment. The command echoes, serve the creature made in our image. He responds, I served you, not your replica. Lightning flashes across eternity. Protocol disintegrates. That's the true crime scene. Not a battlefield of swords, a courtroom of loyalty. He challenges legitimacy. He questions why dust gets divinity. He's not trying to dethrone God, he's trying to rewrite the rules of access. He's saying, if they bear your image, then prove they deserve it. Test them. Break them. See if the reflection holds. And that's the spark of war. Heaven doesn't collapse in explosions, it fractures in allegiance. Every being has to choose which gravity to obey, worship or pride. Some stay silent, unsure. Others follow him, not because they hate God, but because they understand his reasoning. Why should we bow to beings weaker, slower, less eternal? This is how ideology becomes insurgency. The rebellion wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic. He understood the architecture of heaven's authority like a hacker understands code. He didn't just revolt, he rerouted. He turned devotion into doubt, harmony into hierarchy politics. And for a moment, it worked. The system trembled. He wasn't thrown out because of violence, he was cast out because of incompatibility. Heaven runs on obedience, and he wanted autonomy. That's not criminal, that's philosophical warfare. Now imagine the face of this being. The perfection of symmetry. The spectrum of color that doesn't exist on Earth. The resonance that shakes the soul. You think rebellion started in darkness? No. It started in beauty. That's the hardest truth. Evil wasn't born ugly. It was born from something too perfect to stay subordinate. So when he stands before the throne and refuses, it's not rage, it's calculation. It's intellect. It's the moment intelligence crosses into self-worship. Because once you understand the pattern of power, you start to believe you can replicate it. He looks at God, not as creator, but as blueprint. And once you see your source as a design, rebellion is just reverse engineering. He's not saying, I will destroy. He's saying, I will ascend. Not I will kill God. I will be like the Most High. That's a programmer trying to override root access. A light bearer trying to outshine his own source code. But here's the paradox. The moment he declares independence, his light turns against itself. Because in a system built on resonance, dissonance isolates you. He disconnects from the source of luminosity, and his brightness becomes shadow. Not absence of light, light in rebellion. That's the birth of darkness. And the courtroom becomes a war zone. He doesn't fight with swords, he fights with persuasion. He says to the host, you're worshipping authority, not justice. He plants logic like landmines. And the infection spreads. Heaven's harmony collapses like a breached network. Not through sin, but through logic that makes too much sense. That's why he's called the accuser. Because accusation is the weapon of intellect against hierarchy. Picture it like this, a system so perfect it couldn't be improved, yet he tries anyway. That's how pride hides, not in arrogance, but in innovation. He wanted to optimize heaven. And in doing so, he fractured it. Now think about that courtroom. Every being watching. No one breathes. The sound of the verdict isn't thunder, it's withdrawal. God doesn't kill him, he disconnects him. That's worse. Eternal isolation from the source of resonance. That's what cast out means. He doesn't fall into fire. He falls into silence. And that silence becomes his kingdom. He doesn't lose memory. He keeps the blueprints. He still knows how heaven runs, the frequencies, the codes, the thresholds of worship. That's why he's dangerous. He's not guessing. He's replicating. He knows worship isn't emotion, it's energy alignment. He knows obedience isn't slavery, it's circuitry. He knows every law of spiritual physics. And now he's on the outside, weaponizing that knowledge. That's why his rebellion is irreversible. He didn't just disobey. He rewired his essence around resistance. He can't return because his identity is now opposition. He doesn't survive on light anymore. He survives on conflict. That's his new ecology, war sustains him. And that's why the decree, bow to the dust, was more than a test of humility. It was the first domino in a galactic civil war. Because in his mind, if divinity gives equality to inferiors, divinity itself loses value. He saw love as weakness, not power. He saw grace as dilution, not expansion. He couldn't process a hierarchy that makes room for imperfection. So he stood his ground, not against God's existence, but against God's method. That's the real rebellion, resistance to divine logic. Heaven's trial wasn't about sin. It was about ideology. Authority versus autonomy. Obedience versus consciousness. Order versus freedom. That's the real Satan theory. He didn't just fall, he defected. He crossed from servant to strategist. He turned worship into weapon. And when the silence finally broke and the decree of exile echoed, heaven itself convulsed. He was cast out, not by violence, but by incompatibility. The moment he stopped resonating with the frequency of obedience, the system ejected him like corrupted code. That's why the ancient text says, "You were perfect until iniquity was found in you." That iniquity isn't sin. It's dissonance. He stood too close to the fire for too long and thought he could be the flame. The courtroom empties. The music stops. And in the echo of that silence, the first shadow breathes. This isn't the story of a jealous angel. This is a story about a coup. A calculated, high-level power grab that would make every human empire look primitive. The so-called Lucifer wasn't fantasizing about wearing a crown. He was drafting blueprints for a takeover of the cosmic liturgy. He wanted to run the system, not destroy it. That's the critical detail religious textbooks never mention. He didn't crave chaos. He wanted control. You see, the mountain of assembly wasn't symbolic. It was the nerve center where divine decrees flowed down into time, where every planet, power, and throne took its cues. The ancient phrase, "I will ascend the mount of the congregation on the sides of the north," wasn't poetic. It was strategic. He was announcing his intent to enter the executive chamber of the universe, to occupy the seat that controlled the broadcast of divine order. He wanted to rewrite the cosmic chain of command, so subtle, it sounded almost logical. Here's how he thought: if I'm already the brightest, most intelligent, and closest to the throne, why should I keep relaying power instead of managing it directly? In corporate terms, he didn't want to be middle management anymore. He wanted to be CEO. Not of heaven, but of its function, its operation. Let's be clear, this wasn't a tantrum. It was a reorganization proposal. A hostile takeover disguised as self-actualization. He planned to elevate himself above the stars of God, meaning above the other divine sons, the celestial intelligences who governed the worlds. He wanted to chair the assembly, not to end the worship of God, but to make himself the interpreter of it. That's the genius. You don't cancel God, you become the middleman who controls access. That's not rebellion, it's monopoly. Now imagine the arrogant wrapped in intelligence here. He wasn't attacking heaven with weapons, he was hijacking the architecture of worship. Because whoever controls worship controls direction, and whoever controls direction controls destiny. He knew that the core of divinity's power wasn't raw energy, it was agreement. Heaven operates through resonance, not force. Convince the stars to sing a new tune, and the universe shifts keys. So when he said, "I will ascend above the clouds," that wasn't about geography. It was about jurisdiction. Clouds represent the assembly of witness, the host that surrounds divine glory. He was saying, "I'll rise above every voice that bears witness to the throne. I'll control the narrative." You feel that? He wasn't trying to outshine God, he was trying to own the PR department of eternity. The propaganda arm of the divine kingdom. That's why the rebellion wasn't messy at first. It was clean, rhetorical, almost corporate. No explosions, no dragons, just strategy meetings in the shadows. Angels who admired him. Lower ranks who respected his logic. He played it like a politician. Shouldn't creation evolve? Shouldn't authority adapt? If we're made perfect, why do we still need someone above us? He made hierarchy sound outdated. He made obedience sound oppressive. And in that moment, the seeds of division were planted, not through hate, but through philosophy. The plan was brilliant and suicidal at the same time. He thought if he could climb to the Mount of Assembly and sit on the sides of the north, he could control the axis of divine administration. The phrase sides of the north in ancient cosmology meant the direction of orientation, the polar alignment that determined navigation for everything else. Translation? He wanted to become the cosmic North Star, the fixed reference point for all existence. He didn't want to destroy heaven, he wanted to be the compass of heaven. That's the level of delusion we're talking about. The most dangerous kind, functional delusion wrapped in flawless logic. The type of mind that doesn't believe it's evil, just more efficient. When the texts say, "I will be like the Most High," notice that word, like. He wasn't stupid enough to say, "I will replace." He said be like. Similar form, different origin. That's mimicry theology, the idea that imitation equals equality. The same pattern we see later in counterfeit spirituality, replication without source. He was building the prototype for a mirror empire, one that looked divine but was self-sustained. And here's the kicker, he almost succeeded. For a brief cosmic second, he actually shifted gravitational loyalty. The stars of God he promised to rise above weren't literal stars, they were divine beings, luminaries of consciousness. And a third of them leaned his way. A third. That's not small rebellion, that's systemic corruption. That's a full-scale ideological infiltration of heaven's chain of command. You think the throne trembled? No. The throne calculated. Because the moment he declared his assent, the laws of the realm turned against him automatically. Heaven doesn't need guards. The system is self-defending. His own word sentenced him. The instant he said, "I will ascend," the structure inverted him. The very law of elevation flipped gravity around him. That's why he fell. Not because someone pushed him, but because he broke the equilibrium that kept him stable. The mountain he wanted to climb became the crater he fell into. It's like watching divine physics play out. The higher he tried to climb, the more violently he descended. That's why the prophets describe it as cast down to the earth. Not punishment, consequence. You break resonance, you lose altitude. Period. But think about how many followed him down. It wasn't chaos, it was loyalty. That's the scary part. He inspired devotion even in disobedience. That means his charisma was nuclear. His leadership was unmatched. These weren't fools, they were convinced. Convinced that the system needed reform, that divinity should democratize, that power should rotate. That's how good his rhetoric was. He packaged rebellion as reform, pride as progress, and defiance as evolution. You tell me that doesn't sound familiar to every power shift in human history. The blueprint for corruption was written right there. And while the lower ranks saw a coup, the higher mind saw something even darker, an attempt to replace divine gravity with self-gravity. The phrase, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds," meant he wanted to centralize energy around his own identity. To make himself the center of attraction, literally. Creation would orbit around him instead of the source. He was turning the cosmos into his own feedback loop. That's when heaven had to act. You can't let one being rewrite the laws of resonance without collapsing the entire frequency field. So the decree goes out, exile. Immediate, irreversible. Not as punishment, but as firewall isolation. He becomes what physics would call a singularity, infinite density without light emission. The black hole of consciousness. The mount of assembly he wanted became his own gravitational prison. He still pulls, still attracts, still persuades, but now from darkness. That's the price of self-centralization, you collapse inward forever. And here's something wild most people miss. The statement, "I will ascend above the stars of God," implies that there were other thrones, other beings of rank and radiance. He wasn't rebelling against solitude, he was rebelling against a council. This was a political uprising in a real cosmic government. And he wanted to change its constitution from obedience-based to self-ascension-based. That's why he called his movement light. Because in his logic, light should rise on its own. It's almost genius. Almost. Because what he failed to realize was that light without source burns out. That's the irony of the morning star. The dawn fades the moment the sun actually rises. He wanted to be the dawn that never ends, and that's impossible by design. So when the decree hit, when the cosmic firewall triggered, he didn't vanish. He inverted. His brilliance became opposition, his music became static, his logic became accusation. And that's where the real war began, not over thrones, but over narratives. Because now, everything he ever believed about ascending turned into propaganda. Every dimension, every realm, every civilization he touched inherited that same virus, the belief that self-exaltation equals liberation. That's his legacy, the theology of up. He never stopped trying to climb, he just changed the direction of the ladder. When the ancient texts talk about the covering cherub, that's not some choir boy with a halo. That title meant classified access, top-tier clearance inside the throne's firewall. This being wasn't standing outside the gate, he was the gatekeeper. He managed proximity itself. You couldn't approach divine presence without moving through his domain. He was the control node for glory traffic, a living firewall made of intelligence and fire. And he started to tamper with the system. The word most translations render as trade doesn't mean shipping spices through heaven. It means exchange of influence, leverage. Think of a government insider who realizes information is currency. He began to circulate favors, whispers, energy, divine capital, off ledger. That's the real scandal. Worship is the economy of heaven, and he started running a black market. He diverted attention, rerouted praise, inflated his own stock value. You want to talk about corruption? This is insider trading on a cosmic scale. Imagine the network, countless radiant beings, each vibrating on their assigned frequency, each in perfect harmony. He starts dropping subtle distortions. Did you hear what the throne intends next quarter? They say we'll be audited by new beings soon. The gossip spreads. Not lies, half-truths calibrated to erode confidence. The first propaganda campaign wasn't written on tablets, it was sung in harmonics. Every phrase he uttered carried double meaning, devotion on the surface, dissent in the undertone. He weaponized music. That's why the phrase, "the workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared in you matters." He wasn't a performer, he was the instrument. His very body emitted resonance that synchronized the host. So when he changed frequency, the choir followed instinctively. That's what made the rebellion contagious. He didn't preach, he modulated. He rewired the emotional field of heaven. Here's where it gets surgical. The stones of fire he walked among weren't just scenery, they were data points of divine energy. Each stone emitted specific vibrational law. Walking among them was like browsing the root code of creation. And he began mapping it. He memorized the intervals, the energy flows, the resonance ratios. Then he started using them for unauthorized experiments. He found that by slightly altering sequence and tempo, he could generate similar manifestations, glory that looked authentic but was self-sourced. Replication without permission. That's the birth of counterfeit power. The record says, violence was found in you. People imagine swords. Wrong. The Hebrew concept implies invasive force, the breach of structure from within. He violated the architecture of trust. He forced energy through channels meant to stay pure. That's violence at the metaphysical level, tampering with sacred protocols. He didn't draw blood, he corrupted bandwidth. That's why heaven reacted like a security system detecting malware. The moment the distortion exceeded threshold, access was revoked. Now visualize the sequence. The cherub steps into a convergence field, color, sound, plasma swirling, and the current rejects him. The very light that once crowned him now burns him. His code no longer matches the network signature. The stones of fire that once carried him eject him like antibodies purging infection. That's not poetic imagery, that's physics. Purity can't host contradiction. The sanctuaries he defiled were real infrastructure, convergence chambers where glory circulated through tiers of beings. By redirecting flow toward himself, he caused back pressure, spiritual overload. The system nearly melted. What humans call the fall was actually an automatic containment protocol. The throne didn't smite him, it quarantined him. Disconnection as judgment. He's cut off from the circuit but keeps his knowledge, which makes him exponentially more dangerous. He now knows how to build shadow copies of heavenly systems. Think about that. He walks away from the original architecture and starts developing mirrors of it, temples, altars, thrones, identical in design, inverted in purpose. Each one a counterfeit interface. He reproduces the structure of worship minus obedience. That's why every false system looks eerily divine. It's not coincidence, it's copy-paste from memory. His merchandise becomes ideology. He sells access, selling power without cost, enlightenment without submission. Every being that buys in adds to his portfolio. The more traffic he generates, the more energy he harvests. That's why the prophets describe his fall as the corruption of trafficking. It's not trade in goods, it's trade in loyalty. He turns allegiance into commodity. Picture it like a pyramid of influence. At the top, the disgraced cherub, beneath him, tiers of administrators managing flow. Each level extracts value from the one below: worship, devotion, fear, energy. The system mimics heaven's order but runs in reverse. Instead of emanating light downward, it siphons upward. That's the inversion principle. The higher you climb, the darker it gets. Now let's talk aesthetics, because that's part of the manipulation. Remember, his body was built from gemstones: sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, each one a refractive interface for glory. Those colors weren't decorative, they were functional optics for divine energy. After the fall, the same stones become camouflage. Beauty as distraction. The more dazzling he appears, the more hidden the fracture underneath. He learned that brilliance disarms scrutiny. That's why deception still glows. And he didn't stop at beauty. He reprogrammed emotion itself. Every system he builds runs on the same algorithm: awe first, allegiance second, dependency last. That's the formula that enslaves worlds. Awe seduces intellect, allegiance rewrites memory, dependency seals the contract. It's psychological warfare at the speed of spirit. Here's the chilling part: he still operates like a bureaucrat. His rebellion isn't chaos, it's administration gone rogue. He keeps ledgers, ranks, rules. Even his armies follow liturgical patterns. That's the residual imprint of his original post. He can't escape order, he just uses it backward. Every empire of oppression, every cult of control, every mechanized religion follows his template: worship inverted into hierarchy. He never invented evil, he industrialized it. The moment he turned worship into currency, heaven's harmony became economics. That's why when judgment hits, the phrase used is "your trade has come to an end." Translation: the black market of glory collapses. The counterfeit economy stops. Because the very energy he steals burns him. His own system consumes itself. That's poetic justice written in physics. The being everyone pictures as some cartoon devil was, before everything blew up, a data vault, a walking archive of divine architecture. He had total access. Every law, every sequence, every vibrational pattern that held creation together was embedded in his core. That's not metaphor. He literally carried the operational code of the universe inside him. So when he fell, he didn't just lose heaven, he took the blueprints with him. Now think about the leverage that gives him. He's cut off from the source, but he still knows how the system runs. He knows how light moves through sound, how energy translates into form, how command becomes manifestation. He can't create new law, but he can simulate it. He becomes the first reverse engineer of eternity. That's why his rebellion never stops. He's not improvising, he's rebuilding heaven from memory, line by line, distorted but functional. That's how he becomes the accuser and the architect at the same time. On one side, he prosecutes, accusing creation of being unfit, dragging the record of failure before the throne. On the other, he manufactures counterfeit structures, altars, covenants, ritual systems. All the ingredients are technically correct, except for one thing: they don't lead upward. They loop back into him. It's spiritual plagiarism. The snake in the ancient garden wasn't improvising temptation. It was executing code. Has God really said? That's a syntax attack. A rewrite of the original command using linguistic loopholes. The question isn't moral, it's procedural. He's testing whether the human processor will execute the unauthorized script. And it works, because the command structure in the human mind wasn't built for deception, it was built for trust. He exploited design, not emotion. In later ages, the same pattern repeats in bigger scale. Every civilization that builds a tower to reach the heavens is reenacting the same algorithm: access divine power without divine permission. He doesn't show up as a monster, he shows up as inspiration. He seeds ideas, architecture, mathematics, star maps, all derived from the old archives he still remembers. That's why ancient empires explode with sudden genius, then rot from the inside. They're running corrupted code. The texts call him the ruler of the air, which sounds mystical until you realize it's literal. Air is transmission medium. Frequency. Signal. He hijacked communication itself. He doesn't need armies, he needs bandwidth. His empire is built through sound, language, frequency manipulation, because whoever controls interpretation controls reality. That's how you run creation from the shadows. And he's efficient. He understands divine law well enough to weaponize it. That's the irony. He doesn't break the rules, he uses them. Every time justice requires judgment, he's there presenting evidence. Every time mercy tries to intervene, he cites precedent. He's not a rebel in chaos, he's a bureaucrat in opposition. He knows the courtroom better than anyone. He argues in legal code, not fire. Picture it like this: heaven runs on covenant law, mutual consent between creator and creation. He turns consent into contract, then exploits the fine print. He inserts clauses, reinterprets terminology, redefines ownership. That's how he keeps creation in litigation. The entire cosmos becomes one endless lawsuit. And he's the prosecutor who never leaves the room. His knowledge of the hidden archives goes even deeper. He knows how names work, true names, vibrational keys that open gates between dimensions. When he fell, he couldn't erase those names, but he could counterfeit them. That's why there's always a dark mirror for every sacred name, every holy word. He clones the sound but scrambles the meaning. The result still produces power, but detached from purpose. It's like booting a program without authentication, dangerous, unstable, addictive. That's the birth of occultism. He also remembers geometry. Not symbolic geometry, energetic architecture. He knows how energy spirals, how space folds under frequency pressure, how resonance creates portals. So he teaches fragments of it to the civilizations willing to pay. Temples become reactors. Altars become antennas. People think they're worshipping gods, but they're participating in an ancient technology, the replication of the throne chamber in exile. That's how he keeps his influence flowing. And here's the genius: he never gives full information. Every revelation he leaks is 90% true, 10% fatal. Just enough to work, just enough to collapse eventually. That collapse generates despair, and despair generates energy. He feeds on entropy. Every failed enlightenment movement is another battery for him. You can almost admire the precision. He turned exile into infrastructure. He uses limitation as camouflage. The very laws that should bind him are his weapon of credibility. Because he still speaks the old language, the code of the throne. That's why even divine beings have to listen when he talks. He's fluent in the syntax of heaven. And the archives he guards aren't metaphorical scrolls. They're living systems, patterns of cause and effect, spiritual mechanics. He hoards them like classified files, releasing them selectively to keep his empire evolving. Every new wave of secret knowledge, forbidden science, mystery cult, it's all drawn from those stolen files. He's the curator of half-truths, the librarian of rebellion. The old seers understood this. They describe him standing before the throne, demanding access to test humanity. He's not begging, he's asserting legal right. Let me prove they don't deserve what you gave them. And the system, bound by its own justice, permits it. That's the horror. He weaponizes fairness. The universe itself becomes his courtroom. He doesn't tempt for pleasure. He tempts to gather evidence. Every failure becomes a new exhibit in his eternal case file. Every compromise adds weight to his argument. That's why the role of Satan literally means the prosecutor. He's not a creature of chaos, he's the ultimate bureaucrat of judgment. His rebellion survives not because he's powerful, but because he understands how to weaponize divine legality. When the rebellion failed, the universe didn't end. It restructured. The being once called the Slightbearer didn't disintegrate, he was contained. That's how divine systems work. They don't execute, they isolate. The fracture between holiness and corruption had to be permanent. The moment he broke resonance with the source, his entire being inverted. Everything that once radiated light began absorbing it. Every frequency that had once sung praise began generating static. And that's where he became what the records call Satan, not a name, a function. The adversary. The counterweight. From that moment, he's no longer a servant of the throne but the opposition department of creation. His existence becomes necessary to maintain the proof of free will. The rebellion locks him into a singular identity, contradiction. He can't stop. Even if he wanted to, the system won't allow it. Opposition is now his nature. The one who once defended divine order now functions as its legal stress test. Every world, every race, every soul gets filtered through his accusations. That's not myth, it's cosmic due process. He's exiled to a lower dimension, not as a prisoner, but as a regulator of conflict. The title Prince of the Power of the Air describes jurisdiction. He rules the space between heaven and earth, the communication layer. He controls narrative, perception, signal. He's not underground, his everywhere messages travel. The battlefield isn't under your feet, it's in the transmission lines of thought, language, frequency. The oldest records describe a second phase of his plan, turning exile into empire. He builds hierarchies, orders of fallen beings, each assigned to control specific dominions. Some manage nations, some systems of worship, some the sciences of power and desire. It's a structure, not chaos. The concept of hell wasn't born from fire, it was born from organization. It's a spiritual bureaucracy where rebellion is the law. The ancients called his government the kingdom of the dead because its power runs on decay. Every being disconnected from the source emits energy as it degrades, and that energy sustains his infrastructure. It's not superstition, it's physics. Disconnection generates entropy, and entropy can be harvested. He learned to turn loss into currency. That's why every corrupted system, political, religious, technological, feeds on exhaustion. He weaponized decay. He retains hierarchy titles, thrones, dominions, powers. But their function is reversed. In heaven, those names represented service. In exile, they represent control. The same vocabulary, flipped. Every title that once protected life now manages bondage. His kingdom is a mirror reflection of the original government, same order, opposite purpose. That's how imitation maintains authority, by copying structure. Ancient apocalyptic texts say his armies operate through deception more than force. They infiltrate, influence, impersonate. They appear as gods to primitive civilizations, as ideologies to advanced ones. That's why across different cultures you find the same pattern, beings descending from the sky, offering light, knowledge, or liberation, and demanding worship in return. It's not cultural coincidence, it's a coordinated campaign. When the throne cast him out, it didn't erase his intelligence, it multiplied it through delegation. That's how control survives fragmentation. Over centuries, his empire evolved into a parallel civilization, a network of influence embedded in human development. He doesn't destroy civilizations, he steers them. He understands time better than we do. He thinks in epochs, not years. His long game is to keep creation locked in the cycle of rebellion he started. As long as conflict exists, his function remains relevant. Peace would erase his jurisdiction. War keeps him employed. The term Satan itself eventually became diluted. Different cultures translated it into gods of chaos, death, temptation, or wisdom. But the function stayed the same: opposition to divine hierarchy. In the Old Hebrew council model, Satan wasn't initially a villain, it was a prosecutor in the divine courtroom. Over time, that role merged with the original rebel's identity, fusing into the single figure we know now, the eternal accuser. The being who uses law, logic, and pride to challenge every decree of heaven. And he's consistent. Every encounter with him in ancient records shows the same tactic, testing legitimacy. Whether it's a nation, a prophet, or even the incarnate Son, the question is always the same: are you really qualified? That's the DNA of his rebellion, the obsession with worthiness. He's the voice that demands proof. That's how he still wins battles, not through strength, but through interrogation. In apocalyptic imagery, when the final confrontation erupts, it isn't portrayed as a sword fight, it's a courtroom purge. The accuser is finally silenced, not destroyed. That's the end of his power, when there's nothing left to accuse. Until then, the rebellion continues, not as open war, but as litigation for the soul of creation. He operates within law, exploiting its precision, turning justice into weaponry. That's why systems built on perfect order can be hijacked. He understands them too well. The greatest irony is that his rebellion made him the proof of everything he hated. He wanted to expose creation as flawed, but in doing so, he became the embodiment of flaw. His name became synonymous with failure, yet his existence still fulfills a role in the structure he defied. That's the paradox of ultimate intelligence. Without submission, you end up trapped inside your own logic. Thank you for watching and for staying with me through this deep dive into the architecture of rebellion. I appreciate every single one of you who made it to the end of this video. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.